Humans fear war, they claimed, but humanity struck without mercy. The hull was big, bigger than anything built on Earth. The ceiling stretched so high that the upper walls disappeared into shadow, and the lights along the floor glowed a soft blue that made everything look cold and distant. 17 species had seats in this hall. Humanity had one too, though it was newer than the rest, and smaller, placed near the far end of the curved table like an afterthought. Lena Graves sat in that seat. She was a tall woman from Denver, with short dark hair and a calm face that most people mistook for disinterest. She had been a diplomat for 22 years. She had negotiated trade routes, border disputes, and resource-sharing agreements across 4 star systems. She was not a woman who scared easily. But she would be honest with herself later, in the quiet of her quarters, and admit that the room had made her feel small when she first walked in. She did not show it. Across the curved table, in a seat 3 times the size of hers, sat High Commander Zerthos of the Vorkai. He was large and scaled, with a long jaw and pale yellow eyes that did not blink the way human eyes did. His uniform was dark red, decorated with markings that translated, roughly, to the names of worlds his empire had taken. There were many markings. He had been speaking for some time. The Vorkai, Zerthos explained to the council, had a simple and reasonable request. The 3 star systems on the outer edge of what humans called the Kepler frontier were, in his view, poorly used. Human settlements there were thin. The populations were small. The resources were being extracted slowly and without efficiency. The Vorkai Empire, which had the ships and the workers and the infrastructure to develop those systems properly, was simply offering to take on that responsibility. He called it a transition of stewardship. Several council members murmured in what passed for agreement among their species. Lena watched them. She noted which ones leaned forward. She noted which ones stayed still. She had her small translator earpiece in, and she caught not just the words, but the tone behind them. Amusement, certainty, the relaxed posture of people who already knew how the conversation would end. Zerthos turned his pale yellow eyes toward her, and smiled in the way reptiles smile. All jaw, no warmth. The human representative, he said, is of course welcome to object, though I imagine the human government will need many weeks of internal debate before any formal response can be issued. A sound went around the table, something close to it. The Thalari delegate, a tall insect-like being named Vayantos, set a datapad on the table and slid it forward with one long limb. He had been working on a report for the past 3 months, he explained, a careful study of human behavior during conflict. The report was thorough. It examined human media during wartime. It examined protest movements, political debates, public opinion cycles, and the psychological literature humans had produced about the cost of violence. The conclusion, Vayantos explained in a dry and academic tone, was straightforward. Humans feared war more than almost any advanced species in the known galaxy. Not because they were physically weak, the biology was adequate, but because they felt it too deeply. They grieved loudly. They argued with each other. Their governments slowed under public pressure. Their soldiers came home changed, and their societies spent enormous energy processing that change. War, for humanity, was not just a military event. It was a wound that spread through the whole civilization. They will negotiate, Vayantos said simply. They always do. More murmuring, more agreement. Lena Graves looked at the datapad. She did not pick it up. She had read similar reports before. She had read what other species thought of humans. She had sat in enough rooms like this one to understand something that the Thalari scholar, for all his research, had missed completely. He had studied what humans said about war. He had not spent enough time studying what humans did between wars. But she did not say any of this. She straightened a small crease in her sleeve, took a slow breath, and waited for Zerthos to finish speaking. He finished by delivering the ultimatum in the same calm tone a landlord might use when raising rent. Humanity would formally cede the 3 frontier systems to Vorkai administration within 30 days. Or the Empire would begin a process of, he chose the word carefully, correction. The room was quiet for a moment. Lena stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture dramatically. She looked at Zerthos for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked around the table at the other delegates, and then she picked up her things. "I'll pass your message along," she said. Then she walked out. She did not slam the door. There was no door to slam. It was a sliding panel that opened on approach. But the silence she left behind her was louder than any door could have been. A council aide hurried after her into the corridor and asked, with genuine confusion, whether humanity intended to submit a formal written response. She told him they would be in touch. He asked when. She said soon. He asked whether she wanted a copy of the Thalari report for her records. She told him she had already read it. Back on Earth, buried beneath several hundred meters of Colorado stone, a different kind of meeting was happening. The room was not grand. It had gray walls and a long table covered in maps, screens, and empty coffee cups. The lighting was bad. Someone had taped a paper over one of the flickering overhead panels, and it helped only slightly. Colonel Owen Garrett sat at the head of the table. He was a lean man in his mid-50s, with short gray hair and hands that were always still. He had a habit of listening to everything before he said anything, which made meetings with him feel longer than they were, but meant that when he finally spoke, it was usually worth hearing. He had been watching the council feed for the past 2 hours on a screen at the far end of the room. His aide, a young officer named Priya Cole, stood near the door with a tablet. She had been waiting for him to react since Zerthos delivered the ultimatum. He had not reacted. Now he leaned back in his chair, looked at the map of Vorkai fleet positions, and crossed his arms. "They just told us exactly what they think we'll do," he said. Priya looked up from her tablet. "And what do they think we'll do?" "Panic slowly," he said. "Argue publicly. Negotiate nervously." He paused. "Stall." "And what are we going to do?" she asked. Owen looked at the map for a moment longer. Then he stood up and walked to the screen, tapping one cluster of Vorkai ships near the frontier border. "Something they haven't written a report about yet," he said. He told her to get Fleet Admiral Hutchins on a secure line and to block all non-essential communications going out of the Kepler frontier for the next 72 hours. He wanted it to look routine. Nothing unusual. Priya wrote it down. Owen poured himself the last of a cold coffee from a dented thermos on the table, looked at it, and drank it anyway. 30 days, Zerthos had said. Owen Garrett did not intend to use all 30. Humans fear war, they claimed, but humanity struck without mercy. The first week passed quietly. Across the galactic concord, intelligence agencies aimed their long-range sensors and listening arrays at human space and waited for the expected reaction. They waited for political noise, the kind that always followed a crisis in a democratic species. They waited for news broadcasts, public rallies, competing voices arguing over what to do. They waited for the slow and painful machinery of human government to grind into motion. What they got was almost nothing. Trade logs came in on schedule, cargo manifests, agricultural reports from colony stations. A minor shipping dispute near the Vega corridor that was resolved within 48 hours. A human entertainment broadcast about competitive cooking. Another about a sporting event involving a ball and a great deal of running. The Thalari analyst on duty during the third night of monitoring filed a report that said in plain terms, humanity appears to be processing the ultimatum internally. No outward response detected. Predicted behavior consistent with prior modeling. His supervisor approved the report and went home for the evening. Nobody looked harder. Nobody thought to look harder. And that, more than anything else, was the mistake. Deep in the Kuiper Belt, past the orbit of Neptune, past the frozen debris fields that most species dismissed as dead space, 17 shipyards were running at full power. They had been built over 11 years. They did not appear on any public record. They had no civilian supply contracts. They were powered by systems that did not emit the kind of radiation that standard Concorde sensors were calibrated to detect. A technical detail that a team of human engineers had spent 6 years getting exactly right. Fleet Admiral Dale Hutchins stood on the observation deck of the largest yard and watched a warship being fitted in the bay below. He was a quiet man from a small town in Montana, the kind of man who talked slowly because he thought carefully, and who had grown up fixing truck engines with his father on cold mornings when the world was still and the work was real. He had not become a fleet admiral because he was loud. He had become one because he was right, consistently, about things that mattered. He watched the ship below without expression. Beside him stood Dr. Nora Vance, a small woman with paint-stained fingers and the kind of tired eyes that came from working 20-hour days for months without enough sleep. She was a physicist. For 11 years, her research into fold space energy compression had been classified so deeply that her own sister did not know what she did for a living. Her sister thought she consulted for a private aerospace company. It was a reasonable cover. Her work was no longer theoretical. She handed Hutchins a thin report without saying anything. He read the first page, then the third, then the last. He closed it and handed it back. "How confident are you?" he asked. "Completely," she said. "We tested it 4 times. The yield is consistent. The targeting window is what we expected." He nodded. That was the end of the conversation. They both stood and watched the ship for a while longer. And then he went back to his desk, and she went back to her lab, and the yard kept working through the night. This was the thing that the alien scholars had missed. They had studied the noise humans made about war, and concluded that noise was the whole picture. They had read the anti-war literature, the peace movement histories, the psychology papers about post-conflict trauma, and they had built a model of humanity as a species that would always, eventually, choose the easier path. It was not an unreasonable model if you only looked at half the data. The other half was everywhere if you knew where to look. Humans had been building walls since before they had writing. Every city in every age had been ringed with something, stone or moat or wire or concrete. Every generation that marched for peace had also, at the same time, somewhere else, in a building without windows, been designing the next weapon. Not because they wanted war. Because they were afraid of it. Because they understood, on a level so deep it had become instinct, that the only thing worse than a war you chose was a war that chose you when you were not ready. The Vorkai had a word for this kind of preparation. It translated roughly as the work of cowards. They believed that a species which truly had strength did not need to prepare in secret. It announced itself. It displayed its power openly and let the threat speak for itself. Humanity had a different philosophy, though most humans would not have called it a philosophy. They would have just called it common sense. A young Vorkai intelligence officer named Sek Dara would have agreed with the humans if anyone had asked her. Nobody asked her. She was 26 by Vorkai counting, which made her young enough to still take her work seriously, and old enough to know when something was wrong. Her assignment was human military history, specifically the pre-space era, which her superiors considered unimportant. Old wars on a single world. No relevance to modern conflict. She had read it all anyway. She read about a war fought across an entire planet in the middle of the 20th century, in which humanity had mobilized industrial production on a scale that older species found difficult to process even now. She read about weapons held in readiness for decades, not because anyone planned to use them, but because both sides understood that the moment one side stopped being ready, the other would know. She read about a species that had, at one point in its history, enough explosive power to destroy its own planet several times over, and had chosen to sit with that fact rather than let any single group gain advantage. She sat with those numbers for a long time. Then she wrote a report. She sent it to her superior officer, a career man named Vreth, who had been in intelligence for 30 years, and considered himself something of an expert on lesser species. He read the first paragraph, noted the author's rank and age, and filed it under low priority incoming. Sekdara did not know this. She went back to her desk and started reading again, this time about a conflict humans called the Cold War, and the longer she read, the colder she felt. On the final day of the 30-day countdown, a Concord communication station near the Kepler frontier attempted to raise humanity's diplomatic channel for a courtesy reminder. A polite, automated message played, thanking the caller for their patience and noting that the relevant office would respond to all inquiries in the order they were received. The Thalari analyst monitoring the exchange logged it and wrote 3 words in his report. No formal response. Vayantos, the scholar who had written the capitulation paper, was at that moment giving a lecture to a room of graduate students on the predictive modeling of lesser-developed species. He used humanity as his main example. The students took careful notes. In the Kuiper Belt, Dale Hutchins looked at a clock on the wall of his office. He picked up a direct line and said 2 words to the person on the other end. "We're ready." Then he put the line down, laced his fingers together on the desk, and waited for the morning. Humans fear war, they claimed, but humanity struck without mercy. Day 31 arrived like any other day in deep space, without sound, without color, without drama. The stars did not shift. The void did not change. There was no sign from the outside that anything was about to happen. High Commander Zerthos stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the Kepler frontier grow closer on the main display. The fleet behind him was 97 ships strong. It was not the largest force the Vorkai Empire had ever deployed, but it did not need to be. This was not a war. This was a demonstration, a firm hand pressed against a soft door. He expected the door to open. His sensor officer gave the standard approach report. Border markers detected. No active human military presence on long-range scans. A few civilian transport signals near the outermost colony, the kind of small, slow ships that carried cargo and workers between stations. Nothing threatening. Zerthos folded his scaled arms behind his back and allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The ultimatum had worked, he decided. Humanity had chosen the quiet exit. Perhaps the colony administrators had already begun the process of evacuation. Perhaps there would be no need for any show of force at all. Then every sensor on every ship in the fleet went dark at the same time. It was not a gradual failure. It was not a slow degradation. It was instant and total, like a light switch being turned off. Every long-range scanner, every proximity alert, every navigation signal, gone. The bridge of Zerthos's flagship filled with sharp voices as officers called out system failures, backup systems, emergency protocols. Someone was already running a diagnostic. Someone else was trying to raise the fleet on open comm. That was the only thing that still worked. Zerthos gripped the edge of his command console and kept his voice level. "Report," he said. "All external sensors offline," the sensor officer said. "Cause unknown. No detected impact. No detected energy discharge. Duration? Unknown. In the dark. The sensor dark. The navigation dark. 97 Vorkai warships drifted. Their crews were trained. They stayed at their posts. They ran their checks. They were not afraid yet. Strange things happened in deep space. Systems failed. It would resolve. It did not resolve. What happened next happened fast. The human fleet had been sitting in position for 19 days. 112 warships, running complete electromagnetic silence, cold engines and cold hulls, placed in the deep black between star systems, where no standard patrol route would find them. They had not moved. They had not transmitted. They had simply waited, the way a patient person waits, without fidgeting, without doubt. The sensor blackout that hit the Vorkai fleet was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a signal, a very specific pulse that Nora Vance's team had spent years calibrating to interfere with Vorkai sensor architecture specifically. It would not work against other species. It would not last more than a few hours. It did not need to. The human fleet moved from 6 different directions at once. Captain Beckett Rowe commanded the destroyer at the head of the central formation. He was 38 years old, from a mid-sized city in the American South, and he had a methodical way of giving orders that his crew had come to find reassuring. Not because he sounded confident, but because he sounded careful. Careful meant he had thought it through. Careful meant he was not going to get them killed by being reckless. He watched the approach vectors on his screen, and said, quietly, "Weapons hot. Stay on the line." The engagement began. There was no declaration, no challenge broadcast, no final warning sent across open frequencies. Zerthos had issued an ultimatum to humanity, and humanity had answered it. Not with words, but with this. With positioning. With preparation. With a fleet that had been sitting in the dark for nearly 3 weeks, waiting for the exact moment the Vorkai committed to their advance. The Vorkai were not defenseless. Their weapons still worked. Their pilots were trained and their ships were well made. In the first 20 minutes they managed to form a partial defensive grouping and return fire against the closest human formation. 3 human ships took heavy damage. 1 was destroyed. A cruiser on the outer edge of the eastern formation that caught 2 direct hits before it could change course. Beckett noted it on his display and kept moving. This was the part that the alien observers, watching on delayed sensor feeds from a safe distance, found hardest to understand later. The human fleet absorbed the losses and did not slow down. There was no hesitation, no pulling back to regroup, no moment of collective shock. The formations adjusted automatically, filling the gaps left by damaged ships, and the advance continued. The Vorkai had expected the kind of fight where one side draws first blood, and the other side pauses to feel it. Humanity did not pause. In 4 hours, 31 Vorkai warships were destroyed or left without power. 66 were disabled, boarded, or forced into retreat vectors that took them away from the frontier. The remaining ships broke formation. Some fled. Some attempted to surrender. The human fleet accepted surrenders cleanly and without delay. No additional fire on disabled ships. No pursuit of fleeing vessels beyond a certain boundary. The rules were clear, and they were followed exactly. Zerthos's flagship was boarded in the 3rd hour. Beckett led the team himself. Not because it was his job exactly, but because he felt it was right. The High Commander was found on his bridge, standing, which Beckett respected. Zerthos looked at the human officer in front of him, this ordinary-looking person in a gray uniform, a little shorter than he expected, with calm eyes and no expression of triumph on his face at all, and said nothing for a long moment. "You were not supposed to do this," Zerthos said finally. His translator rendered it plainly. "No," Beckett said, "you thought we weren't going to." He had Zerthos secured and moved to a holding area. Then he went back to the work of clearing the ship, section by section, methodically, the way he did everything. Across the Galactic Concord, alerts fired in every intelligence office simultaneously. The feeds were confused at first. The scale of what had happened was not immediately clear because nobody had been watching the right part of space. It took almost 2 hours for a coherent picture to assemble, and when it did, The reaction was not the controlled, professional response that institutions like to project. Van Toss received the alert in the middle of his lecture. He read it twice. He told his students the class was over. He sat down at his desk and did not move for a very long time. The emergency council session was called within 6 hours. Lena Graves had been in her quarters when the session request came through. She washed her face, changed her jacket, ordered a coffee from the small dispenser near the door, and walked to the hall. She took her seat at the far end of the curved table, the seat that had always felt small. She set her coffee down, looked around at 17 species of wide, uncertain eyes, and waited for the room to go quiet. "We didn't want this war," she said. She let that sit for a moment. "But you should know something about my species. We have been afraid of war since the first time we picked up a rock, and we have been getting better at it ever since." Nobody laughed this time. "Humans fear war," they claimed. But humanity struck without mercy. The galaxy did not go quiet after the engagement. It went loud in the way that a rune goes loud when everyone starts talking at once. Not out of celebration, but out of confusion and something that sat very close to fear. Intelligence offices across a dozen homeworlds ran back through their data and tried to understand how they had missed it. How had a fleet of over 100 warships been assembled, positioned, and held in complete silence without a single detection? Where had the ships been built? When had the mobilization order been issued? How far back had the planning gone? The answers, when they started to come in, were uncomfortable. The ships had been built over 11 years. The planning had begun long before the Vorkai ultimatum. In fact, as best the analysts could determine, the strategic framework for a large-scale covert mobilization had been in development for at least 15 years. Humanity had not responded to the ultimatum by building a fleet. They had responded to it by using one they already had. This was the detail that changed everything. It meant that while the Galactic Concord had been watching humanity argue and protest and negotiate across decades of interstellar relations, humanity had been at the same time building something nobody was supposed to know about. Quietly, patiently, without announcement. Several member species of the Concord that had quietly supported the Vorkai position, not loudly, never loudly, but with small votes and softly worded statements, began working very hard to make those positions disappear from the record. There were requests to amend minutes. There were diplomatic clarifications issued. There were polite messages sent to the human embassy that used phrases like, "Of course, we always believed in the validity of human territorial rights." Lena Graves received these messages and read them and filed them away without responding. She would respond eventually, in her own time. Van Toss did not issue a public retraction of his capitulation paper. Instead, he simply stopped responding to interview requests, withdrew from 3 upcoming speaking engagements, and locked the document behind a restricted access code that prevented new downloads. His graduate students noticed, so did his peers. He did not explain himself. He sat in his office with the door closed and reread his own work, and tried to find the place where his logic had broken down. He found it on page 4. It was a line that read, "The human aversion to prolonged conflict will in nearly all model scenarios override strategic ambition." He had written it with complete confidence. He had supported it with 47 footnotes. He had been looking at the wrong variable. He had measured how much humans hated war. He had not measured how much they had practiced it. Sekdara, the young Vorkai intelligence officer, was removed from her post and brought in front of a senior review board 3 days after the engagement. She expected to be punished for her ignored report. Instead, she found a room full of exhausted senior officials who wanted to understand how a junior analyst had been closer to the truth than all of them combined. She explained it the same way she had written it. She had not done anything clever, she told them. She had read the human military history from the beginning, without skipping the early parts. And the early parts, the primitive conflicts, the world wars, the cold standoffs, were the key to understanding everything that came after. Humanity was not a species that had discovered war and then moved past it. It was a species that had lived with war for its entire existence and had developed, over thousands of years, a very specific relationship with it. They feared it deeply, and they prepared for it constantly. And the fear was the reason for the preparation, not the opposite. One of the senior officials asked her what she thought the Vorkai should do now. "Talk to them," she said. The senior official looked at her for a moment. "That's it?" "Yes," she said. "Talk to them before they decide they're not done." She was reassigned to a new post within the week. The post had more resources and a bigger office. Nobody said the word promotion. Everyone understood that it was one. On the human side of things, the victory was not celebrated the way the alien observers expected. There were no parades. There was no footage of cheering crowds broadcast across the Concord feed. The human government issued a formal statement that was careful and measured, acknowledging the engagement, confirming that all relevant laws of conflict had been observed, and noting that humanity remained open to diplomatic resolution. It was the kind of statement that said everything clearly, without sounding like it was celebrating anything. This confused several species greatly. The Thalari, in particular, had always believed that military victory was an occasion for public display. It communicated strength. Humanity communicated strength differently. Beckett Rowe was back on his ship doing paperwork. The destroyer had taken damage in the engagement. 3 crew members had died. 7 more were in the medical bay, with injuries ranging from minor to serious. Beckett had visited each of them on the day after the battle. He had sat with the ones who were awake, and talked about ordinary things, about what they wanted to eat when they were back on solid food, about whether the ship's engineer had fixed the climate issue on Deck 4, about nothing in particular. He did not talk about the battle. They did not need him to. The paperwork for the 3 who had died took most of the morning. He filled out each form the same way he filled out everything, line by line, completely, without rushing. He would write the letters to the families himself. He always did. He did not dictate them, and he did not use a template. Each letter was different, because each person had been different. And it seemed to him that the least he could do was notice that. His young weapons officer, Calvin Drew, found him in the officers' lounge that evening, staring at a wall, with a cup of cold coffee in his hand. Calvin was from Ohio, 24 years old, and still in the part of his life where he was not sure if asking his captain questions was appropriate. He had decided tonight to try. "Does it feel like a win?" he asked, sitting across from him. Beckett thought about it for a moment. A real moment, not a polite pause. "It feels like the right answer to the wrong question," he said. "They asked us if we were willing to fight. We answered. That's not winning. Winning would have been them not asking." Calvin turned that over for a while. "Do you think they'll ask again?" "Not these ones. But someone will. Somewhere. Eventually." He picked up the coffee, looked at it, and set it down again. "It's why we keep the ships." He told Calvin to get some sleep, and Calvin went. Beckett stayed a little longer. He thought about the 3 names on the forms he had filled out that morning. He thought about their faces, which he knew well because he made it his business to know his crew. Then he stood up, took the cold coffee to the disposal, and went back to his desk to finish the letters. Owen Garrett, watching from Colorado, told Priya Cole to give the Vorkai moderate faction 4 more days before opening the diplomatic channel. "Why 4?" she asked. "Because 3 is too fast, and 5 is too slow," he said. 4 days means we're not eager, and we're not vindictive. It means we're ready when we're ready." She wrote it down. "Sir," she said, after a pause, "the Concord feed is calling it a decisive human victory." "I know. They still don't understand what happened, do they?" Owen looked at the map on the wall, The same map he had been looking at for weeks, now with updated fleet positions, and new markers where the engagement had taken place. "They understand that we won," he said. "They don't understand that we were never trying to impress them. We were trying to end it." He paused. "Those are very different things." Priya looked at the map too. "Is it ended?" she asked. Owen did not answer right away. "This part," he said finally, "this part is ended."
In the cold void of space, where silence reigned supreme, a small neutral station orbited a long-dead star, remnants of a fiery past, now reduced to a mere husk. This station, constructed by the Concorde generations ago, stood as a testament to diplomacy, a sacred ground devoid of ownership. A place where words could be wielded like swords, without the looming weight of home-ground advantage. Here, amidst the stars, the air hummed with potential and tension, a fitting backdrop for what was to unfold. Lena Graves stepped off the small transport, her feet touching the metallic floor with a soft thud. The smell of recycled air greeted her, a reminder of the artificiality of her surroundings. She was alone, accompanied only by her resolve and a team of 4, devoid of military escorts that others might deem necessary in such precarious times. Lena chose this path deliberately. She wanted to convey a message of peace, not one of intimidation. Each step she took echoed her determination. She was here to talk, not to show force. 20 minutes later, the Vorkai delegation arrived, led by Senator Horath Val. He was a broad figure, his deep scales shimmering under the station's harsh lights. Each movement he made was deliberate, a reflection of 30 years spent navigating the treacherous waters of governance. He had seen empires crumble and rise, and now, as he faced the human across the table, he found himself grappling with a palpable tension that twisted in the pit of his stomach. Their eyes met, and Lena held his gaze without flinching. In front of her lay a small notepad, a pen, and a cup of steaming tea, the only armor she needed. "Before we begin," Horath Val's voice was gravelly, weighted with the history of his people. "I must say that the decision to issue the ultimatum was not unanimous within the Vorkai Senate." Lena responded with an understanding nod. "I know, it rarely is." He hadn't expected her to be so informed, to be so unyielding in her perception of his people's internal conflicts. But in that moment of unexpected honesty, he felt a flicker of respect for her. The negotiations spanned 2 tense days. Humanity's requests were simple yet profound. Recognition of territorial sovereignty, the withdrawal of military assets, and the return of 3 human researchers. Each demand was a thread woven into the fabric of their fragile peace. Horath Val felt a strange blend of relief and unease as he read the human document, a sentiment he had not anticipated. As they worked through the precise language of their agreement, Lena found Horath Val surprisingly agreeable. His honesty stood in stark contrast to the political games she had anticipated. He was a man of his word, and as they crafted the terms of their peace, a bond began to form between them, built on mutual understanding and respect. On the evening of the second day, weary yet resolute, they found themselves at the same plain table, devoid of an official agenda. Horath Val offered a drink that smelled faintly of spices, an attempt at camaraderie. Silence enveloped them, comfortable yet charged. Lena sensed it was time for the question that loomed over their discussions. "Why?" he asked, his voice soft, yet probing. "If your species fears war as deeply as every study suggests, why did you strike with such force? Why not a warning?" Lena cradled her cup, the warmth seeping into her palms. "Because we know what war costs. Every human knows. It's embedded in our history, our families, our stories. We carry that weight with us. We didn't want a long war. Nor did we want you to think we would eventually capitulate. To stop a war, you must show the other side that the conflict they envision is nothing compared to the reality they will face." Horath Val fell silent, digesting her words. "It feels like a contradiction," he admitted, his brow furrowed. "It is a contradiction. We contain a lot of those," she replied, her eyes steady. As the final documents were signed the following morning, the air bustled with cautious optimism. Concorde witnesses observed the proceedings, broadcasting it to a galaxy teetering on the edge of upheaval. Back on Earth, Owen Garrett drove home, reflecting on the sacrifices and losses that lined his thoughts like worn pages in a book. He stopped at a diner, darkness stretching beyond the window, and received a message that echoed through his mind. Council feed is calling it a decisive human victory. They still don't get it, do they? Priya Cole's words lingered, heavy with unspoken truths. He pondered the meaning of victory, the price it carried, and the weight of history that hung over humanity. Typing a single line, he declared, "No, and that's fine." Outside, the stars remained unchanged, a silent testament to the passage of time. But somewhere out there, across the deep, dark void, 17 species lured in new truth. That fear, in humanity, had never been synonymous with retreat, but rather a catalyst for preparation, a memory of pain that echoed with a vow, never again. And beyond Neptune, as the yarns kept running, they would not stop.